Dear Klaus, dear Veronika, dear Alexandra, dear guests, as program director, I'd like to welcome you most warmly to tonight's evening, The Regime of the Charlatan. At the Thomas Mann House, we are endowed with the most wonderful literary and political heritage, and we want to take every opportunity to mediate between the legacy of Thomas Mann and the social and political questions of our time. That's why we were particularly grateful and pleased when Claus Leggewie approached us and asked us to take a fresh look at Thomas Mann's Mario and the Magician. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Hungarian literary critic and philosopher George Lukács called Mario and the Magician Mann's first political literary work, and he declared, "What we are concerned with here is the mass tactics of fascism, the use of suggestion and hypnosis. The defenselessness of those German bourgeois who did not want Hitler, but who obeyed him for over a decade with demur, has never been better described." This enigma of political seduction and deception haunts us to this day, as you probably know. And we are delighted to have as guests our honorary fellow Claus Leggewie and renowned political literary scholar Veronika Fuechtner, who will approach the figure of the charlatan in conversation with Alexandra Lieben. Let me briefly introduce Alexandra before I hand over to you. Alexandra Lieben is the Deputy Director of the UCLA Berkel Center for International Relations and lecturer at the Luskin School of Public Affairs. She has served as faculty advisor on several social impact projects at the UCLA Anderson School of Management and teaches crisis de-escalation, conflict resolution, and cultural competency to UCLA students and professionals in the public and the private sector. Alexandra is also a member of the Thomas Mann House Advisory Board. Finally, thanks to those who supported the organization of this event in the background. First of all, my dear colleague Benno Herz, also Elena Dexter, Josephine Klaus, and Betty Ramirez. I wish you all a good, insightful evening, happy holidays, and please give a warm applause to Claus Leggewie, Alexandra Lieben, and Veronika Fuechtner.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the welcome to this very important event, a wonderful discussion that reminds us how pertinent and how incredibly important it is actually to reread this novella for all the meaning that we will discuss. With me here today is on my right, Veronika Fuechtner, who is Fuechtner, I'm sorry.
Fuechtner, that's fine.
Veronika comes from Dartmouth, where she is the interim chair of Jewish Studies and associate professor of German Studies. But you also teach in women's studies and gender studies.
And in a medical school.
And in the medical school. So, and you are currently writing a book about Thomas Mann's mother.
Yes.
Who was Brazilian, which is really interesting, and also about his construction of race and Germanness, which is equally pertinent, I would say. Your research interests include history of psychoanalysis and sexuology, relationship between science and culture, discourses on race and ethnicity, all of which is important for our conversation today. Claus Leggewie, next to me, welcome, studied social science and history at the University of Cologne and in Paris. Got his doctorate at the University of Göttingen, served as faculty member at many different universities in Europe, had guest lectureships, and is now the Ludwig Börne Senior Professor at Justus Liebig University in Gießen, and of course, the fellow here at the Thomas Mann House. His work deals with questions of democracy in culturally pluralistic societies in the age of digital information and communication technologies, as well as memory cultures and the sociocultural and political effects of climate change. So especially the questions of democracy, right, in culturally sort of pluralistic societies is really interesting for us to consider in the conversation today. The format for today, we'll start with Claus, who gives an introduction to the novella itself and shares his remarks, followed by Veronika, and then we have a conversation, and then we open up for Q&A.
Thanks for coming. I'm really honored to be here in general for the invitation as an honorary fellow in this wonderful house where the ghost of Thomas Mann is always with us, but also excited because I'm not a philologist and I talk about Thomas Mann in this house. So this evening is for and about Thomas Mann. And we'd like to take you to Italy. As you are in 1550 Sanremo Drive, it's easy to imagine yourself at the beach in Italy and at the Riviera, and with you the Mann family at a vacation stay in Forte dei Marmi in August, September 1926. So that's where you are this evening, before we come back to the United States and Germany. And there in Forte dei Marmi, which is called a different way in this novella, all the events of Mario and the Magician are said to have taken place exactly as Mann assures, with the notable exception of the tragic end. I'll come back to this in a moment. Why this novella and what is Mario about? At first sight, a bourgeois family, 2, not 6 kids in this case, travels to the Riviera for the usual summer vacation, but this time feels increasingly uneasy, not so much because of the African heat, but because of the hostile atmosphere, outbursts of nationalistic aggression, and the frequent disrespect they have to experience as foreigners. Let me read a short passage so you get the feeling and catch the style of the novella. I quote, "Gradually, we understood that we were in the presence of a national ideal. The beach, in fact, was alive with patriotic children, a phenomenon as unnatural as it was depressing. Children are a human species in a society apart, a nation of their own, so to speak. On the basis of their common form of life, they find each other out with the greatest ease, no matter how different their small vocabularies. Ours soon played with natives and foreigners alike. Yet, they were plainly both puzzled and disappointed at times. There were grounded sensibilities, displays of assertiveness, a rather hardly assertiveness, for it was too self-conscious and too didactic to deserve the name. There were quarrels over flags, disputes about authority and precedence. Grown-ups joined in, not so much to pacify as to render judgment and enunciate principles. Phrases were dropped about the greatness and dignity of Italy, solemn phrases that spoiled the fun. We saw our 2 little ones retreat, puzzled and hurt, and were put to it to explain the situation. These people, we told them, were just passing through a certain stage, something rather like an illness. Perhaps not very pleasant, but probably unavoidable." End of quote. So the mishaps continue and ripple through the story until Mann builds up masterfully the family visit to the performance of a magician, especially longed for by the kids. A magician named Cipolla, who gives an eerie performance in a proletarian cinema hall, insults and belittles people chosen by him from the public, and is, on the very last of 60 pages, pistol whipped by a young man named Mario, whom he sadistically has ridiculed and deeply defamed. The context: the novella was written in summer 1929 on another beach in Rauschen, East Prussia, literally on his knees, just a finger exercise, Fingerübung. Mann didn't want to schlep the voluminous manuscript and materials of the Joseph novel in progress. In retrospect, he assessed his impromptu exercise as follows, I quote, "From the anecdote, the fable, from casual communicativeness, the intellectual narrative, from the private, the ethical symbolic, suddenly grew for me. A disgusting character, a murder, is this just an impromptu exercise? As I said, Joseph und seine Brüder was by far the main occupation of the author, who shortly after the completion of the transcript is awarded the Nobel Prize, which he felt that he thoroughly deserved. Mario was published in 1930 Translated in the US a year later, not so in Italy, from where Mann was reported the repressions against his translator for political reasons. That was the situation in Italy. Mussolini, at the height of his power and popularity, a role model for the rest of Europe. 1930 is a crucial year. In the September elections in Germany, the NSDAP dramatically increases its number of seats from 12 to 107, becoming the third largest parliamentary group in the Reichstag. Between 1922, when Mann expresses himself as a Republican in favor of the Weimar Republic and incurs the hatred of the right-wingers who had taken him for one of theirs, and 1929, we witnessed the making of an anti-fascist, the mutation of an apolitical conservative, as he described himself, into a democrat of reason and heart. At the time of Mario and the Magician's publication in 1930, Mann had ruled out any strictly political interpretation of the novella. But after Hitler was made chancellor, and especially in light of his bellicism, Mann came to see his own novella differently, confessing in his lecture on myself in 1940, I quote, "A political illusion, never directly stated, was quite well understood then in Germany, long before 1930. Understood with sympathy or annoyance, the warning about the dictatorial violation, overcome and annihilated in the liberating human catastrophe on the conclusion of the conclusion." That's interesting. He points to the end of the story. The immediate reception of Mario went into another direction. Mostly the novella was read as an allegory and sometimes trivialized as light-weighted travel literature. I have chosen this particular novella because in my view it is very topical for our time. I read it first as a young student, and the fact that I did read it again 50 years later is due to the recent reprint of Grete De Francesco's excellent book, Die Macht des Charlatans, The Power of the Charlatan, first published in 1937 in Basel. The young author sent a 12-page handwritten letter to the esteemed Mr. Thomas Mann, along with a copy of the book. She insisted that Mann was the intellectual patron saint behind her work. This book would never have been written were it not for the wake-up call provided by his Mario and the Magician. Modestly yet confidently, De Francesco made plain the connections between Mann's novella, her own subject of study, and the spread of fascism. An English version of the book, The Power of the Charlatan, came out with Yale Press University in 1939, to which Mann provided a short testimonial. The book turned out to be more successful in the United States and eventually became well known among exiled writers and even in Hitler's Germany, where censors and the Gestapo recognized its explosive potential and promptly pulped as many copies as they could get hold of. Since then, De Francesco's study was largely forgotten until the brilliantly annotated reprint appeared with German publisher Die Andere Bibliothek this year. We need to appreciate the author in more detail. Under her maiden name, Margarete Weissenstein, she was born as the oldest of 3 daughters in Vienna in 1893, studied art history in Munich, married the engineer Giulio De Francesco, with whom she lived in Milano and later in Berlin. In 1931, De Francesco became the first woman ever to graduate from a progressive German Akademie für Politik, Deutsche Hochschule für Politik, with a thesis entitled The Face of Italian Fascism. Working as an author and journalist, she fled persecution in 1933 to Praha, Paris, Basel, Zurich, Milano. And after the occupation by the Germans, De Francesco was arrested by the SS in October 1944 and transported to the women's concentration camp at Ravensbrück, where she was presumably killed, falling victim to the biggest charlatan of all times, Adolf Hitler. To wrap up, De Francesco's book is a fascinating historical examination of the charlatan figure that remains valid. She starts off with the definition of the charlatano from 1612, one who sells salves and other drugs in public spaces, pulls teeth, and exhibits tricks of legerdemain. Mann makes Thomas Mann makes reference to those Italian origins in Mario and writes, I quote, Cipolla had in this whole appearance much of the historic type. His very clothes helped to conjure up the traditional figure with its blatantly, fantastically foppish air. His pretentious costume sat upon him, or rather hang upon him, most curiously, being in one place drawn too tight, in other a mass of awkward folds. There was something not quite in order about the figure, both front and back. That was plain later on. But I must emphasize the fact that there was not a trace of personal jocularity or clownishness in his pose, manner or behavior. On the contrary, there was complete seriousness, an absence of any humorous appeal. Occasionally, even a cross-grained pride, along with that curious self-satisfied air so characteristic of the deformed. None of all this, however, prevented his appearance from being greeted with laughter from more than 1/4 of the hall, including his kids. Drawing on a variety of historical sources, De Francesco traces the path through early modern Europe, dwelling on alchemists, worm doctors, magnetizers, prestidigitators, and mountebanks. De Francesco manages to distill the traits and behaviors of all these historical figures into an archetype of the, quote, the charlatan as a paragon of the fraud, who robs truth, knowledge, and the word of their validity and seduces its gullible victims. She carefully avoided drawing conclusions for her own time, and yet her observations on the nature and mechanisms of charlatanry are valuable not just for the dawning of fascism, but I believe for the early 20th century as well. The charlatan, or fake as we would perhaps say, is shrewd rather than intelligent, a sciolist, the self-proclaimed expert with little real understanding. He does not imitate, he distorts, not least reality, by means of his falsehoods. He relies on science as mirror and antagonist, perverting all empirical evidence and theoretical sophistication, and lampooning it through his use of poorly understood terminology. Charlatans form no unified profession. You will find them in all classes and lines of work. What matters is the métier's habitus and the orientation towards their own gain. Where the pedant seriously considers every detail, the charlatan is well aware of the triviality of what he advertises. The former deceives himself, the latter others. The charlatan is related to the impostor, the alchemist, the seer, the magician, or the occultist, to whom man himself had been reluctantly attracted in Munich in the 20s. However, while these engage in the business of transformation, the art of charlatanry is confined to giving promises that are impossible to keep. No scientific falsification, no political decrees will stop the charlatan or deter the wide-eyed crowd. That is most important. The charlatan is nothing without a following, a group of believers mainly made up of weak and disappointed individuals whom he despises and looks down upon. They want to be deceived. After all, especially in times of crisis and turmoil, captivating the strange interactions between the charlatan and the audience during Cipolla's performance, Mann asks himself and his readers, why didn't we just leave? The charlatan's only real opponent is an individual skeptic, or what De Francesco called, I quote, the small minority of incorruptible men and women who lived unknown and even avoided as though they were the carriers of infection among the herds of believers. When she concluded her study by asserting that if it was these solitary individuals who were at all times called on to lead the fight against the power of the charlatan, she no doubt thought about Hitler. Spontaneously, I had to think of Georg Elser, the resistor who in 1939, completely on his own, carried out a narrowly failed assassination attempt on the Führer. 10 years later, another Californian exile, Leo Löwenthal, from the Frankfurt School, transferred the European type of the charlatan to the United States. His study of mid-century authoritarianism, Prophets of Deceit from 1949, is concerned with the willingness to subordinate to a leader figure, to believe in conspiracy theories, and hold in contempt liberal elites and intellectuals. This was in 1949. The adherent, he writes, quote, remains a frustrated underdog, and all the agitator does is to mobilize his aggressive impulses against the enemy. The image of the adherent thus serves indirectly to condition the audience to authoritarian discipline, end of quote. And he continues as if he wrote this today. The agitator intensifies his listeners' sense of bewilderment and helplessness, terrifies them with the specter of innumerable dangerous enemies, and reduces their already crumbling individualities to bundles of reactive responses. He drives them into moral void in which their inner voice of conscience is replaced by an externalized conscience, the agitator himself. In a similar direction, David Riesman argued in The Lonely Crowd from 1950. I would call it political nihilism. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you to the Thomas Mann House and also to Claus Leggewie for having me here to have this discussion. Claus Leggewie talked about the setup of the story and the political afterlife of the story. And I wanted to touch a little bit upon the political prehistory in a way. So I think you can argue that this novella, this fiction, is actually a contribution already at the time to an ongoing debate about the nature of group psychology in general. So it's a long debate. And at this very moment, in around 1930, this debate turns into a debate about the nature of fascism. So how does fascism work? And the Mann scholarship has identified the sources that Mann used for writing Mario and the Magician. So Mann comes at this from texts about the analysis of masses and their leaders. So a very important text is Gustave Le Bon's work from 1895, The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind, it's called. And what is important for Le Bon is really the seduction of power. It's seductive, it's attractive. And he also works with contagion, the idea of contagion in group psychology. And Mann really runs with this idea in the story. So we have, in the beginning, one of the children has a whooping cough. And in the hotel where they are, this creates a commotion. And there's the discussion of the idea that this is actually acoustically contagious, right? And this is debated. And Mann really follows this motif of acoustic contagion through the story. So we have Cipolla cracking a whip every time he hypnotizes one of the audience members. So there is a sense of acoustic contagion that goes through the story. That's just one example. Another important text for Mann is Sigmund Freud's Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego from 1921. And I'm going to try to boil down Freud's argument, but basically Freud aligns the psychology of groups with primitivity. It's a kind of state of regression. And man is a horde animal. We all have this archaic inheritance in ourselves that can be triggered, that can be brought out by a charismatic leader, by a hypnotist even. And so group psychology for Freud is a sort of amplified hypnosis. We all share an external ego ideal. And this process can only be interrupted for Freud not through a solitary person, not through an individual, but through heterosexual love. So that is what can resist this process for Freud. Now, in Mann's text, this is interesting because he takes a lot up from Freud. So there's definitely an alignment of the mass and primitivity. We have this signaled throughout the text in class. I mean, the people in the audience are kind of signaled as working class. We have it in terms of race. There are allusions to Africa. We have it in terms of allusions to children as primitive. And he does also follow to some extent this notion that the formation of a group psychology is a homoerotic realm. So he does follow that. And that's, of course, a trope of fascism theory. It becomes really important later, the homosociality of fascism. And it's interesting because Mann doesn't do that in other texts. He does it here. Male homoeroticism here is grotesque at the end. It's not attractive. And this is actually not something we're used to seeing in Mann's text. So clearly, Mann's text supports the idea that fascism is based on some sort of Freudian economy of sexual drives. But I think it does more. It goes further. And so I think that the text really works with showing how an experience of rejection and humiliation functions as a basis for sadism and manipulation. Cipolla is, you've already described, he's abject, he's deformed, he's grotesque, but he also depicts himself as a victim, right? He views his performance even as a form of sacrifice to the audience. It's this kind of perverse dynamic that is established here. So the relationship to the audience is really framed in terms of almost a sadomasochistic relationship. And this is also another important trope for the theory of fascism later on. For example, in Wilhelm Reich's book, Mass Psychology of Fascism, which came out 3 years later than Mann's text, where Reich describes the sadism of fascist leaders as rooted in sexual anxiety. So I wanted to move briefly towards how Mann's text is a commentary on crowd manipulation in what it narrates, but also it's also a commentary in how he narrates it. And so some of the readings of this text are about how the narrator loses control of the text somehow, right? So the narrator is helpless. There's the sense that he's not in control of the performance. He doesn't take his children home, but he's also not in control of the text. But there's also the reading that you could say narration here is actually a form of exerting control. So the narrator becomes some sort of illusionist, a charlatan, a hostile narrator, a corrupt narrator, maybe a propagandist, right? And I think there's a lot of evidence for this kind of reading in the text. So I'll give you just a few examples. For example, the first sentence. The atmosphere of Torre di Venere remains unpleasant in the memory. This is how it starts out, the text. So we know already it's a construction of memory. There's this movement. It's unreliable. It's memory. It's fragments. There's this constant search for what happened. So that's already the setting. Then the places in this text, they're not quite real. They're like stage settings. The tower that gave the town its name doesn't exist anymore. The name of the town is kind of an empty marker. It's an unreliable sign. And we have in the beginning this long description of tourist towns in general, tourist towns as kind of stage settings. You hunt from tourist town to chase peace, and peace is pretty loaded here as a term. So there's also something about the unreliability of the places, the changing nature of places. You've already mentioned the context of the cinema. So the performance takes place in a cinema. And that's really, really crucial because Mann here references the cinema debates of the 1920s. What is the power of cinema? What can cinema do? How is cinema propaganda? And this also predates some of the analysis of propaganda from the 30s, Siegfried Krakauer, for example. And Mann comes down on the side of, he's still on the fence at this point. He's really mistrustful of the medium at this point, and you can tell that in the text. Finally, the final point I want to make in relation to this corrupt narrator, problematic narrator, is the way the children function in this text as a narrative device. So the central premise here in regard to the children is that they fall asleep, they're being entertained, and they're not really paying attention to what's going on, and they don't understand the violence of what they're seeing. And this seems really far-fetched. I mean, they witness, it's an 8-year-old girl and her brother, roughly the same age, who witness a shooting. Would they really believe that this was a play. This is clearly also not in Freud. Freud doesn't believe that children are innocent or oblivious to what goes on. And it's not really there in other texts by Mann either, who has other texts about children that are much more subtle and complex. And so in some ways you could say that the narrator fails to read his children. He fails to understand their complexity and their rich emotional and intellectual world. And he keeps reassuring his children and also the reader with it that everything is just fine. This experience of the rise of fascism in a small Italian town, it's an ending, it's not a beginning. And the last lines of the text are, was that the end they wanted to know, the children? That they might go in peace. Again, peace, very important. Yes, we assured them, that was the end. An end of horror, a fatal end, and yet a liberation, for I could not and I cannot but find it so. So the narrator assures his children, as well as the reader here, this is Italy, we can go back to Germany, everything's fine, my little one, don't you worry. So it's also the reader who's being belittled, not just the children. And I think this is where the narrator becomes complicit politically. The narrator becomes some sort of magician insofar as he tries to let the events vanish. So I'll stop here and we can jump into the discussion.
Thank you both very much. Both of you brought up really important points, and I feel like I want to bring it a little bit to sort of the conundrum we are dealing with, and that is the reemergence of the charlatan, right, all over the place. It's not just in America, it is in Europe, we see it in many different places, and the followers to go along with it. What are we looking for, right? Why do we continue to be so susceptible, right, to being drawn into, being hypnotized? Is it that sort of the symbiotic relationship between the charlatan and his audience, because everybody gets something from everybody? And so here's like the in that sense is like, we talked about like just yesterday, is like, is it too simplistic to say it's like this, that it's because of the discontent, the disorientation that a lot of people feel at the current time, whether it is about migration, globalization, whether it has to do with technological progress, whatever the case may be, people feel that they cannot catch up. So they're looking for somebody who gives them easy answers. That's one sort of, and the place to rest, scapegoats, reasons why things are the way they are. But we also thought that was too simplistic, right? It's like there's more to this than that. And that's, I wanted you sort of to elaborate on that.
I think it's too simple to say. I mean, we can always say, yeah, there's this capitalist crisis, finance crisis, 2008, et cetera, the migration. But I had the chance to follow the career of the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban since '88. That's when I knew him, and he was a very promising young liberal, uniting a youth party. You couldn't enter the party when you were over 35. It was called Fidesz, and it still exists, and it has a monopoly of state power and party capture of this Hungarian state. And I followed his career, and he, for me, is a true example of a charlatan. He's very intelligent. He's not stupid, but all the characterization of that De Francesco has put forward here, I think it fits in a way. Okay, it's different times, but and I followed his career, and he is just manipulating people about one thing that is called white supremacy here in this country, and that's why the migration issue was so important for him, because this was the proof that Merkel and others would like to import foreign races, Muslims, strange religions, danger to Europe. And in 2017, he once declared, 20 years ago, we thought Europe is our future. So this is the normal transformative democracy. New democracies develop, they modernize, they liberalize, they are getting economically successful, etc. And then he added, and now we think we're the future of Europe. So this is his political project. And this doesn't answer your question. So what is about the Hungarians who vote for him? Because he's not a dictator. He has a majority of 65 or 60% for the first time now. So why do people follow? I think this is the main question we have to answer, and I have no answer for that. But I think we know a lot about your former president or the private life corrupt life of Viktor Orban. We know everything about them. So this is like an open book. They tell us what they have in mind. They're not hiding anything. Like Cipolla, he doesn't hide anything. He's preparing his tricks, and people. Why do people follow? And that's why I quoted Thomas Mann. Why didn't we leave? Why didn't we? And this is exactly what you touched upon. I think the problem is not we in general, because this is a false we, because there are different publics, even in this cinema hall. But the problem is why the interaction between this leader, this charlatan, and his followers. And I think this is the important point, and we have to, we have to make them responsible that they follow. People who still would vote for Trump the next time, they are not innocent Opfer, victims of his propaganda or whatever, or of Republicans who manipulated them. No, they're absolutely responsible for what they're doing. And I think they know exactly what they do. And that's why I call it political nihilism. Because this is not about the right and the left. This is not about the traditional cleavages of political systems. I think this is exactly the total negation of what is going on in politics. And they know this is their goal. If you look at, I'm finished now. I will stop now. If you look at the stories, the stories, the so-called Querdenker, the lateral thinkers in Germany propose when they are interviewed, it's complete nonsense. You know it from QAnon, etc., etc. I think they are absolutely responsible for what they say. They are very, very aware of what they're doing. And when people are asked, why don't you go and get vaccinated? They say, well, I don't know, I've heard stories. No, they know exactly the truth about vaccination, but they reject. And they have to be made responsible. I'm not a partisan of this victimization theory, not at all. Neither by Ali Hochschild or whoever wrote about this, about the poor people who had to follow. Nobody has to follow them. They are responsible for what they do. So that is mine.
Can I jump in? I don't have an answer either. I'm a literary scholar. But I do think this question that you brought up, why didn't we leave, which is in the text, why didn't we leave? It points also to the fact that these kinds of charlatans offer a really compelling narrative that you want to see through to the end. You want to know how the story ends, and that's why you're staying. And the story is horrible, and you want to look away maybe at the time, but you still want to stay and see how it ends. So there is something about becoming part of a really compelling narrative that might actually be even harmful to you, but you want to see it through to the end. I think that's what De Francesco also picks up on. And maybe one other point that I think Mann and De Francesco have in common, and that I think a lot of the authoritarian leaders we see today display in a way. De Francesco talks about how the charlatans don't have a sense of humor. I think this is a really important point. So humor opens things up. It creates ambiguity. It creates empathy, right? It creates different perspectives. And none of these figures have that. There's no space for that. And I think that's a really important observation for thinking about these phenomena today.
Yeah. And self-irony.
Yeah.
And humility.
And that's why I can shoot a person on Fifth Avenue and you will still vote. It's not a joke. Yeah. That's why it's not a joke.
Serious. Exactly. It's really serious.
I mean, that's a striking thing that everybody they have always signaled what they're going to do, right? Hitler, Mein Kampf. It's like, we have it all there. It's like, that's right. That's right. And Trump said the same things. Like, I mean, there was really nothing new about this. But I think there's one reason why so many people are drawn in is because they dream. It allows them to dream, right? Of another life, of another world. It allows them to forget the past, right? Feel better about the future. It's like everybody has sort of their reasons. It's highly corrupting. Because we talk about the narrator also, right? Has sort of this class consciousness as he sits in this, even as he sort of just like goes through the town, right? And it becomes more and more working class. And it's like, and what am I doing here? It's like, I feel superior, essentially, but then gets just as drawn in as everybody else. And is curious about the end, right? And sort of gets drawn in, becomes sort of a co-perpetrator, right, of the whole spectacle. And that's why it's like, who is going to break the spell? Like that's what we come back to, right? It's like we talk about like contest of wills. It's like who actually sort of snaps out of it. And is it, as De Francesco said, is it the single actor, or is that enough? You know what I mean? It's like, it's sort of, what are we going to do? But here too, it's like, I mean, that we have seen time and time again, it's like sort of our hope here, the description, right, talks about the sort of working class, blue collars, like people with less education, less maybe critical thinking skills, but at the same time, or experiences, at the same time, everybody's corrupt, everybody has a reason. So we cannot, I feel like we cannot look for hope in the sort of the more educated realm. It's like I think back to, I'm from Vienna. Everybody, people from all classes lined Ringstraße when Hitler came in, right? I mean, educated people, working class, absolutely everybody. Same with Trump. Everybody had a reason why they voted for him, right? So that goes back to like, so we cannot look for anything to them. Yeah, to everybody. It's like, but who breaks the spell?
If I knew this, I would be counseling our new chancellor in Germany. No, but you had an interesting point aside. They can forget the past. It's an interesting story, which I also mention in the enlarged paper, which should be published in Los Angeles Review of Books. And I end with a magician. His name is Kalanak. There was also a book about him recently published. Kalanak was, I have a picture with me showing him at the Obersalzberg doing tricks for Hitler and his entourage. And he was one of the closest person to Adolf Hitler, and he was a magician, and he was kind of obsessed by this Kalanak. And Kalanak, this is not the problem for me. Kalanak didn't stop in 1945. He was denazified. Is that correct? Denazified? It's terrible, the word. He was denazified, and then Nazifiziert, and then immediately started his career anew. And he was one of the most famous magicians in the 50s. I still remember this guy. He was in TV because he had a leopard, yeah, with him, always with him. And his wife had a leopard coat. So he made people forget what happened. So he belonged to those people who drew people into this totalitarian scheme, and after it, he was helping them to get out, to forget, by forgetting it, and simply saying, we have to be, and by the way of a miracle, by way of, yeah, as a magician, what magicians do. And there was another, there's just a study of, forgot the name of the author for the moment, about Gröning. He was a healer. And 10,000 flocked to Gröning, and he also was an SS man. So he kind of, this is in a way, before and after 45, these guys simply could go on, and they had the same masses in front of them.
Maybe I can pick up on something you said about the question who is breaking the spell, right? Who can break the spell? And in De Francesco's book, I mean, and that's something you touched upon. It's about education, right? But clearly, this is not, this is not a viable a model. And so this is also discussed at the time, I mean, Walter Benjamin, he wrote this review of De Francesco's book, and I wanted to read one sentence from it because I think it's so powerful. The manipulation of masses is not some form of black magic against which you could set the white magic of the elites. So it's not an answer to look for hope in education. So that answers maybe a little bit.
Yeah. But it's also like that sort of gets back to the question, like, is there freedom of will? Can we separate ourselves, right? Where's the individual, or where do we sort of blend in with the group, right? And the psychology that comes with being part of a group. So does it exist? Freedom of the will?
Philosophers in the room?
Yeah, that's above my pay grade.
Well, no, because we experience it all the time, right? We ask ourselves all the time, it's like, is this my decision?
Well, for De Francesco, it exists. And that's why she exposes these individuals. This is not just like Georg Elser, the resistor, just he alone. He talks about people, groups, communities who resist, who keep their common sense, and she's talking about them, and that's what Hannah Arendt does in her book on totalitarianism, when she explains why certain countries resisted more against Nazi Germany and the occupators, and did not collaborate. And I think she is talking, and this is exactly the model of Yad Vashem, to point out certain people and to present their image, their personality, their model, their role model, as saying, well, you have to follow these kind of people who didn't lose their mind in front of these charlatans or dictators. I think this is the answer. Yes, there is free will. You have always a choice. This is why I was talking about the responsibility of those who voted for Orban or others, or Kaczynski in Poland. You have always a choice, and there is a free will. This is not totally manipulated by Cipolla and others.
I think for Mann in this story, it maybe is not quite there yet, or it's more pessimistic, really. I mean, the narrator is complicit, and there doesn't seem to be an outside really possible in the story. But Mann, of course, changes, right? I mean,
10 years later,
exactly, it's a completely different story, and he actually uses the means of propaganda, right? I mean, he really exactly. So he addresses, he goes on the radio and all of that, right? So I mean, clearly there's a huge shift. So his answer would be yes, absolutely.
And it's like we use it all the time, right? Every political rally, every organization, every marketing effort, all of this, right? We're being manipulated all the time, but it's like for something that we subscribe to or something that we reject. So here's like we make up our minds all the time. What strikes me also at this particular time is that we live in what some people call an attention economy, where everybody, right, you have YouTube personalities, you have people with millions of Instagram, Twitter followers, all of these people, right, who basically sort of can espouse to anything they want. It enters the ether unchecked, people pull it down. Facebook, we know all the issues, right? But here too, it's like, how do you get that genie back in the bottle? Or what do you do about that? Like, and here, I think it becomes all the more important to learn to discern, right, and step back and check the facts and check the sources and try to figure out. And that is what we use, like we all at universities is like, that's what like, we need to teach people critical thinking, right? It's like, I mean, check your sources. And that's where the individual responsibility comes in, right? Like, and I don't know how we can hold people accountable who hold them accountable for voting for the wrong cause or the wrong people. That's harder to do than trying to help people sort of make better decisions, or in our minds, better decisions. But I think the single individual, right, that sort of has a real effect of changing also a process or a trend is somebody who just suddenly resonates. Because here too, it's like, as Mann changed over these times, it's like, we all change all the time, right? It's like, tomorrow morning, we're different people. And in some ways we are. So in that sense, it's like...
At least one day older. Yeah.
something suddenly speaks to us. And so that's why it's like, how can we amplify those voices? So here being strategic too, and you can call it also manipulation if you want, but basically it's like, I mean, it's sort of how it's forces against forces in some ways, right?
I think the way we deal now with COVID is exactly an exercise for that, because on the one hand, if you look at people who are simply refusing against all knowledge they have, against all possibility they also have, they simply refuse to do that. And now they are kind of sanctioned by laws in Germany. They have less opportunities, etc., etc. So it becomes critical for them. And some go for vaccination and others still refuse. And I think on the one hand, you need a certain repression. A state monopoly of power must be established against this danger. These people are dangerous. On the other hand, you have to talk to them, to convince them. You have to tell them, yes, you need to. It's better if you do. So this is exactly how many do you get like this? This is a test for what you were just asking. Are they to be convinced, or are there stubborn refusers? And this is what all our societies worldwide have to experience now, to experiment with. I just wanted to add one thing because you say about complicity. How do you interpret this statement of 1940 when he says people understood exactly what it is about, as Mussolini and Hitler understood with sympathy or annoyance the warning about dictatorial violation, and here the last sentence is overcome and annihilated in the liberating human catastrophe of the conclusion. So this is an interpretation. You could say, well, he is killed, or this is the catastrophe in a Aristotelian sense or so, yeah? So there is and that's why he seems to be so relieved that he can leave now with the kids. So this would be a slightly different interpretation of this phrase, yeah.
Right, and I mean, but I do think the ending is more open than he makes it out to be. I do think that there is, the narrator presents it as a sort of liberation, but is it? I mean, I really think the ending allows for more, allows for different reading. And I think in some ways, and that also goes back to your question, it is the novella is also about the importance of reading and the carefulness of critical thinking, not taking everything for true, what the text actually presents, right? So being able to distinguish what is illusion, what is, charlatanry, and what is happening, that's what the text is about. So is it a liberation? I mean, I think there's doubt. And Thomas Mann might present it strategically.
In 1940.
Exactly, for strategic reasons in a particular way, but it doesn't mean that that's all the story is. Yeah.
And Mario is not rewarded for killing him, right?
He's arrested.
Right. So it's like actually the group turns on him. So it's like people did not snap over the whip. It's like, I'm out of my trance, right? But no, I don't want to give up my dream. Yeah. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.